This guy, Campbell Harvey, who actually discovered the correlation between an inverted yield curve and a recession, warned us that in his opinion, a recession is coming in 2024.
And this inversion is not even at the average length. Okay, so the average length is more like 13 months. So what it's pointing to is a recession in 2024.
With that said, this same guy a year ago said that he believed that this indicator would produce its first false positive in over 50 years and that a recession was not on its way. So why the flip-flop from the inventor himself? I think that is the starting point to this discussion because it highlights how different and how difficult this current economic cycle is to predict. So let's talk about it. As always, my name is Derek and I got my degree in finance, so you don't have to. Now, before we begin, let's define what a yield curve inversion actually is and why it has predicting power when it comes to a recession. In the most simple terms, a yield curve inversion is when the yield of short-term bonds invert with the yield of long-term bonds. You see, in normal circumstances, the yield on a long-term bond should be higher because there is usually more risk. Because the longer the time frame, the harder it is to predict the future. For example, will the United States be around next year? Probably. Okay, but what about in 50 years? Probably, but that probably is with a little bit of less certainty. Hence why yields are usually higher, aka more risky, the further out we try and look. So when yields invert, it means that bond investors see more risk in the short term than in the long term. And that usually means that a recession is around the corner. Now, one more thing. It's usually the 10-year and the 2-year bonds that people look at when it comes to yield curve inversions, but some academics focus on the 10-year and the 3-month. In either case, when short-term bonds have a higher yield than long-term bonds, it usually means that trouble is on the horizon. So what does all this have to do with today? Well, since the 1960s, this indicator has given 0 false positives, and its record stands 8 for 8, meaning that since the 1960s, it's predicted with accuracy every single major recession. And on July 5th, 2022, the 10-year and the 2-year bond yields inverted, and they've stayed inverted ever since. On top of all of that, Cam Harvey, the person who discovered this correlation in the first place, says that there's usually around a 13-month lag between the inversion and the recession. And for example, Scott Lander with Horizon Investments says that there can actually be up to an 18-month lag, which basically means we're due for one right now, or more simply put, sometime in 2024. But wait, what about Campbell Harvey saying that this would actually be the first false positive since the 1960s, before changing his mind again and saying that a recession actually will show up in 2024? Well, again, this highlights the complexity of the current economic cycle and how difficult it is this time around to predict what will happen next. Why? Well, for one, he says that this indicator has simply become too well known, and when it inverts, companies are likely to take action to mitigate that recession risk, which is something that I totally agree with. All last year, I kept saying, how the f are we going to have a recession if everyone is planning for a recession? Now, that's not very scientific of me, but sometimes common sense just makes sense. And in this case, it did. And on top of that, the strong economic data in 2023 made recession less likely every day that passed, like strong unemployment numbers and GDP growth in the face of high interest rates from the Fed. And currently, those numbers are still very strong. Unemployment is still under 4%, even in the face of high interest rates that have been going on for longer than a year. And GDP growth is still above 5%, which is a very strong number, especially for a mature economy like the United States, especially in the face of high interest rates. Okay, makes enough sense, but once again, Harvey has changed his stance and is now calling for a recession in 2024. And he's not the only one. For example, the New York Fed's recession probability model suggests that there's still a 51.8% chance that the US falls into recession. And UBS also expects a mid-2024 recession, and in fact believes that that recession will be the reason the Federal Reserve finally starts cutting rates. So why the change from Harvey, and why the recession prediction from major institutions? Well, for Harvey, he believes that the money has just simply run out, and that credit and consumer spending will not carry the economy in 2024 like it did in 2023.
I know 2023 might be a little surprising in terms of the robust GDP growth, but that's purely driven by consumer spending, money saved up during COVID, stimulus, and that's run out. Now the credit cards are being depleted, so consumption is not going to save the economy in 2024.
He also believes that the Fed way overcorrected for inflation and that it has kept rates too high for too long. But there are also economists who believe that we will avoid a recession in 2024. For example, a Reuters poll of economists puts the risk at around 45%, which is actually down from 60%. And Fitch, a giant credit rating agency, sees no recession in 2024. And I myself do see a slightly higher chance of avoiding recession, probably taking the New York Fed's slight edge of 51.8% chance of recession and flipping that, giving the slight edge, in my opinion, to avoiding recession. But it's a very slight edge. And for me, I think unemployment data and GDP growth are still very strong, and I completely understand that there is a lag between interest rate changes and how those changes affect the economy, which means we will almost certainly see those key numbers get worse in 2024. But the runway for unemployment and GDP growth to become recessionary is very long. And really, for me, my big concern is sticky inflation. If inflation does in fact become sticky in the 3% range and high interest rates have a hard time budging it down below that range, as we move into 2024, the Fed might have to delay cutting rates. And while I do believe that there is a very long runway before we end up in recession territory, the longer we remain in a high interest rate environment, the more of that runway we use up. But barring sticky inflation and barring that the Fed way overcorrected for inflation, I give the odds, although very slight, in the favor of a slowdown but not a major recession. But the real answer, nobody fucking knows. And on top of that, quantitative easing just makes it that much harder to predict. Because even when there should be a recession, if the Fed steps in and injects a ton of money in the form of quantitative easing, it kind of throws the rulebook out the window. So really, what can you do? You can be diversified, you can keep a long time horizon in your lens for investing, you can do your own due diligence, and you can keep trucking along. Because there will always be economic obstacles in sight. But 2024 could be just like 2023. A great year for investing that many investors missed because of the fear of recession. And even if there was a recession this year, a long time horizon will mitigate that risk. And if it doesn't, then I think we have much bigger problems on our hands. Other than that, I hope this video was informative and I hope it provided insight into what we might expect in 2024. If you like personal finance, world economics, and investing broken down simply, you are in the right place, so please consider subscribing if you haven't already. This is a relatively new YouTube channel and it helps us tremendously. And don't forget to turn on the bell notification so you don't miss the next video. New videos are usually released on Tuesday, but if something important like a Fed meeting or like an interest rate change happens, I'll usually do a video on Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday to bring that information to you guys as soon as possible. Other than that, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.